Hello everybody and welcome back to another video. Today I am going to be doing a bit of an off-season preview, my first real 2023 video for this next season of the Overwatch League. Don't worry, power rankings are still coming. I just want to get this video out quickly because obviously we're starting to see bits of information come out, and so before everything starts to kind of come out and before we get real big major news on what types of movement we're seeing with the different teams, I want to get this video out, inspired a bit by Sports Talk Radio. This video idea is called Rebuild, Retool, or Return. I'm going to go through all 20 Overwatch League rosters from the 2022 season, and I'm going to tell you if the team should rebuild their roster, meaning they should basically blow it all up, start over, and bring in basically an entire new roster, save for maybe one or two pieces that they hold on to. Retool, which means I think this team has a good core and foundation to this roster, but I think that they, in order to hit the next level of what they can be, need to make some pretty major changes in just a couple of areas. And then finally, Return, which is a team that I think has a very solid roster that, you know, save any type of retirements or just contract losses and stuff like that, free agent losses, should try to keep this current roster they have together as best they can. Maybe there's one or two places where they can improve, but not in a way that I think it's like they're going to dramatically change the trajectory of their season if they make those changes, right? So that's generally what it is. It's not a super fixed rule. Like, it's not like Return means if you lose more than two players, it's a retool or anything like that. Kind of generally speaking, that's the way that I'm going to view this. And I'm going to not talk much about anything like, I'm not going to theorize or speculate anything. I'm going to go off of the assumption that every team has the ability to bring back as many players as they choose to do. We've had some players who have announced that they're retiring or they're moving on or something like that, and there's some rumors in general. And I'll touch on those if they apply, but in general, I'm going to assume that if a team wants a player to return, that player can return. And so that is the assumption to go off of based on here. I might not mention a rumor that you may have heard. I maybe haven't heard it. And just understand there's a bit of a suspension of disbelief with this video, but you'll understand as we go. So let's jump in, and we're going to do this in alphabetical order. So let's start from the top with the Atlanta Reign. I think this roster should return in general. I think this roster is very solid. I like a lot of what they've done. I think OG Ultraviolet, very, very solid support line. When you consider what this team's identity is as a Western roster, very unlikely you'll find many, if any, pieces better. Vigilante I like as well. I don't know if he fit into this roster super well, so maybe you get another support to kind of be as your number 3 instead of Vigilante, but also Vigilante is very good. If you want to bring him back, you can. I think this roster will be fine. I think Kai and Speedily will be much better next season. When you consider the fact that Speedily didn't get a lot of scrim time before he turned 18, that's why Nero, I think, generally looked better. He spent a lot more time scrimming with this team, and so in that regard, I think that the Reign should look better with a Kai and Speedily duo at the helm next season. Nero is going to be leaving this roster. He tweeted about it. He also mentioned going into this season that he basically was going to retire until he got this offer from the Reign, and he chose to take it. So he's gone. Venom, who knows what's going to go on there. Tank-wise, I like Hawk a lot. I think Gator probably goes from this roster, but I think with Hawk you can do a lot of good things. Maybe bring in another young tank as well to kind of bolster that tank line. But in general, I like this Reign roster. I think they would struggle to improve much based on what their identity is. So I think in general they should return the majority of this roster, and I think they'll have likely a better year next year with year 2 of Kai, Speedily, OG Ultraviolet. I think this roster, as it is now, is relatively strong and will be better next year with a couple of small changes, minor tweaks that I think will make this returned roster overall pretty solid. Next is the Boston Uprising. This roster, I think, should go full rebuild mode going into 2023. Laurie's gone. President of Gaming Huck is gone. Mineral is gone. Baroy is gone. This roster, this organization has lost essentially all of the upper management and coaches that they've had over the past several seasons, and so I think at this point in time you just rebuild. Change your identity, change what you are, and just go full rebuild mode. I've hated the way this team has continued to kind of do these really small, minor changes every season, despite the fact that they haven't been good since 2018, and they've been basically chasing the high that 2018 brought them. They just need to go full rebuild, gut this whole roster. Yes, they have talented players, but they've shown that this system is not the one for them. They are better individuals than they are as a whole. They would all, I think, do better in another system. And so to me, you got to go full rebuild and just gut this roster and have a new identity created for the Boston Uprising. Next is the Chengdu Hunters. I'm going to say this roster should retool their roster. I think with Leave and Jinmu, you have a very solid foundation for your DPS, but you need another piece there. Aprito was a really good addition to this team early, that they lost, of course, because of the way that they changed their direction with the roster and finances and stuff like that. I think you need another DPS player, though. I don't think you can rely on just Leave and Jinmu. They're talented. They don't cover everything enough, so I think you need another player there. Was not super happy with the way Daitsa played throughout the season. I'd rather see Gaga either learn to flex to other tanks, or I'd rather see them go after somebody in free agency, maybe someone like Liga, who I think could be a good addition to this team. But I love the support line here. I love Nisha and Monk. I think they can play pretty much everything you need them to play. Maybe you get another flex support, but I don't think it's a necessity. In general, I like what this team has. I like their roster a lot. They just have a couple spots I think they need to make some changes, but I think if they make those changes, this roster, as it is generally speaking, will be pretty good. I don't think they need to make major changes, so I think Retool is probably the best direction forward for the Chengdu Hunters. Moving on to the Dallas Fuel. They were your 2022 champions. Of course, I think this roster should return. There's definitely arguments to be made that they can make some improvements in that DPS line, get a really, really strong, dedicated, long-range sniper player who can cover the Widow, can cover the Ashe. Gurrio is not that guy this year, and while Edison has had his moments, in particular on Sojourn, his long-range hit scan was not nearly as good as a lot of the other ones in the league. But I think you can rely heavily on Edison and Sparkle. Fearless might leave. He's an older player. He's a veteran guy. But if he returns to this team with Hanbin and Fearless, you cover everything you need with your tanks. And Chio and Fielder were the best support line in the league this season. You don't need to make a lot of changes here. You might lose Doha as well because he doesn't really fit in this roster super well. But generally speaking, you just make minimal change, if any change at all, to this team. And I think they will be fine. Going forward, they shouldn't make major changes. Their roster, as it is, very, very strong. Obviously, they just won the grand finals, so you don't want to really do too much to hurt what you have done so well so far. Florida Mayhem, I think this roster should retool their roster. I love a lot of what they have. Gunba has gone on and said that he is potentially going to leave this roster, but he is in negotiation with the Mayhem, so who knows where that's going to go. I think he'll probably return. I think he did a really good job this year. And we saw that the Mayhem have some really solid pieces. Someone had a really good year. Obviously, really good year from Hydron as well. Checkmate had a pretty good year. Surmajed, Rupol, both of them had a pretty good year. So I think you can make some improvements to this roster. I think they're going to find some places where they can make some improvements in contenders with rookie talent. Maybe like a new main support instead of having Animo. Maybe another DPS player to pair with Checkmate and Hydron, but I think in general this roster is in a pretty good spot. I like what they've done so far, and I think minimal change is the future for this roster. So I think this roster should just retool it, bring in a couple new pieces just to kind of flesh it out a little more. You know what you've done. You've seen how this roster can perform pretty well. Now you tend to see it hit its peak, hit its max, and I think that's what Retool would do for this roster. Up next is the Guangzhou Charge. I think this roster should retool their roster going into 2023. This roster had one of the best second halves of any teams in the league, obviously going 8-4 in the second half of the year. The only teams that had a better record in the second half were the Shanghai Dragons, the Seoul Dynasty, and the Dallas Fuel. So second half of the year for this Charge team was very, very good. But they did have, in my opinion, some noticeable areas for improvement, namely in that tank role. They couldn't really play Winston at a high level or anything like that in the main tank category. And so I think that this team needs to go for a main tank. I don't think they're going to keep both Krong and Piggy. I think they'll rebuild around one of them. I don't know which one, but I don't expect this team to keep both of their off tanks. So I think they will make some changes, but I think in general, you look at what this roster was at the second half of the season. They were solid, and I think that they're in a position where they don't need to make major changes to make this roster work. next year. So I think that they should just retool. I think they had a good year, so I don't think they should do too much to change this roster's identity. Next is the Hangzhou Spark. I think they should retool their roster. This is a very different team than a lot of other retooled rosters. And the fact that I think the Spark just need to trim the fat. They consistently have a lot of players on this roster. I think they just need to cut some of them out. You need to limit what you have. They had 4 DPS players. We barely saw Architect this year. We barely saw Pineapple until Stage 4. So I think the Spark really do need to just kind of trim some of the fat, sort out their support line. I like Bernard a lot. I like Gouchway a lot. I think you can probably find some way to keep one of them and then replace the other with another tank player. In general, I like this Spark roster. They had a very good playoffs. They need to build around ATVI and Shy. That's the key to their roster. I also really like what we've seen from Super Rich. So I think there's some room for improvement for the Spark roster, but I don't think they need to make major changes in terms of their core. I just think they need to trim some of the fat and find some ways to improve other areas of the roster bit by bit. But I like what they've done a lot. And I think that they have a bright future if they know how to kind of approach rebuilding this roster properly. Next is the Houston Outlaws. I'm going to say this roster should retool. I love what they did down the stretch. If you can keep that Pelican and Merit DPS duo, I think you have an incredible starting kind of point. I think you have to get a main tank, or it's the tank in general. I love Dante. I think he's done a great job for this team this year. I think he has limitations. He can come in and fill for you when you need him to, but I think if you want to be a championship team, Dante cannot be the tank that leads you there. He can be on your team. I think he's a very good DPS player still and could provide for the team in that way. But I think they need to look at the tank role. They need to look at the support role. I loved what they did this year. Lep didn't get a lot of playtime. Doge and the tank didn't get a lot of playtime. I think last year was pretty good on the main support. I think they would do better if he could continue playing flex support. I thought creative was good as well. So I wouldn't be upset if they kept the majority of this roster and just added a tank and added another support player. I think this roster would be in a really good spot. So I don't think they need to change too much, but I think that there are some areas where they can improve this roster quite significantly, and that's what they should be eyeballing going into the 2023 season. Next is the London Spitfire. I think this roster should return, generally speaking. Very similar to the Atlanta Reign, this Spitfire roster has an identity as the Western European roster, and I think that when you look at what they had a very good year this year. I think you're going to struggle to find a ton of better players on the market. I think they're probably going to look at DPS. Teams almost always find someone that's really good in DPS. We barely saw Shax this year, so I assume Shax is going to be off this team, and they might find someone to kind of fill in some of those similar roles. I wouldn't be surprised if Poco leaves this team, so maybe they want to go for another tank beside Hadi, but we'll see. Support line, I think, is really good this year. I think Admiral is their main support for the future. And between Landon and Khan, you can keep one or both of them, and I think you have a really solid team as a whole. So I don't think the Spitfire need to change much. I think they found their coach. They found a really strong roster. Maybe a couple things need to change, but I think in general, they have their starting core for next season, and I don't expect them to change too much as they go forward. Next is the LA Gladiators. Despite their somewhat disappointing playoff run, I will say this roster should return. I think that this team has a lot of good things going for them. I think they need a third DPS player, but I would not be disappointed if they kept Happy and Kevster as their main DPS duo. Just get someone else to kind of fill in potentially that third DPS spot. I think you always should have 3 DPS players, and having just 2 is never a good call. But I think that you're going to struggle to find a better support line than Funny Astro, Shu, and Skewed. I could see them maybe adding a new off-tank if Space chooses to leave this team, or whatever. And I think Reiner is a really solid player. That, to me, is probably the area I think they should most invest in another tank. I don't think they need to do a lot to the support, and I think they should get a third DPS. But generally speaking, this roster is really good. I think you should return as much as you can and build around what you have established so far as a pretty strong roster and go forward with that instead of looking to rebuild or even make major changes to this roster. Next is the LA Valiant, who I think should rebuild. I don't know what this team is going to be in a year from now. They don't have a head coach right now. I don't know if they're going to be an Eastern team or a Western team. It's really hard to tell what this team is going to be. They were the worst team in their region this past season. So despite the fact that they had a much better team this year than they did last year, it's not that hard when you win 0 games. So I think they're probably going to go through a rebuild. I think they probably should go through a rebuild. I liked a lot of what they had this year. This was a pretty fun year for the Valiant. Even if they weren't very good, they were at least entertaining to watch. Dia played well when he got to play. So I don't know what the LA Valiant are going to be going forward, but they just need to rebuild this roster. I think that's the best move forward for them. I think they'll look better if they do that, personally. And so to me, just go for a rebuild, figure out what you want to be, and go from there. I hate to say that these teams should rebuild every season, but they're the hardest team to read because we don't know what they're going to be next season. Next is the New York Excelsior. I think they should go full rebuild. I don't like what they've done so far. I think that since 2020, they have just not had an identity, and they've had a relatively poor job scouting talent. I liked some of the pieces they had in 2021, but the majority of that roster did not work. Really, the exceptions were Flora and Gwangbun, who I actually thought both played pretty well, and Jonak had a pretty good year as well. Not his best year, but he had a decent year. This year, Yaki was good. Flora was good. That was kind of it. They had moments where they looked okay, but they just did not have the coordination. I don't think they had a right coaching staff. I don't think they've done a great job scouting talent. And so to me, this team should just go full rebuild. Maybe hold on to Yaki and Flora, but even then, I think this team's best bet is just to look at a contenders team and bring in as many of those players as they can and just kind of go for a similar thing to what they did in 2018 and try to actually build around a core for the future. They seemingly don't want to do that. They've been going around just one player for the past couple of years, and it doesn't work. So I think they need to just go with a full rebuild, figure out an identity, figure out players they want to use for the future, and work around that. Next is the Paris Eternal, or I guess the Las Vegas Eternal now. And I think the Eternal should retool their roster. They didn't have a good year, right? There's no denying that they were the worst team in the Overwatch League this past season. But they did make major changes late in the season to their roster, and based on what Avala and Faustus have talked about, it seems like they want to go forward with a lot of the pieces in their roster. I don't think they're going to keep everybody, but I think they're going to try to build around Luke Mino and Rack Attack. I think those two were probably the best parts of this roster down the stretch when they added them. It's hard to tell when this team didn't have a great performance. I thought Dove looked pretty good as well. He had a pretty consistent performance, so I think they'll probably build around a couple of those players, but I think in general they should retool this roster. Not a full rebuild, I think, is in the books for them. It just doesn't seem like what this team wanted to do, so I think they'll probably go forward with a semi-rebuild and retool this roster instead of going full new on it. Philadelphia Fusion, I think, should retool their roster. I love MN3 and Zest. I think they're the DPS duo for the future. I thought Fixa had a pretty solid year as a whole. I don't think that he should be someone that you are immediately looking to replace. Bellisria, I think, is a pretty good spot on this roster as well. Cartbay's most likely leaving. We'll see what happens to the Fury. He's a veteran guy. I thought he played very well this year, though, so I wouldn't be disappointed if they kept him. And I think you can probably improve at the flex support role. Obviously, 2022 was difficult for them in that position, so that's really where I think this Fusion roster can improve and what they can build upon. But in general, I like this roster a lot, and I think they had a lot of good moments. I just think there's some clear areas they should look to just bolster so that this team can be better next season. San Francisco Shock, I think you return this roster. There's a lot of good pieces on it. There's definitely some areas I think you can improve upon, but I thought Kaluja and Mikey were pretty good for them. You can find a better tank, I think, who can be more well-rounded, but I think that overall they were pretty solid. I'd like to see them get a traditional main support, though Violet had a good season on the role, so maybe you just keep him there. DPS, obviously you have the guy for the future with Proper. If you can hold on to Striker, I think he's a good kind of complementary piece. What do you do then with Kilo and Sam? Up to you, but I think you can find good ways to make them work. I think Proper can be your hit scan guy if you need that hard hit scan Widow play. He's had a very good performance in that. Get a traditional flex DPS. There's a lot of good ones in contenders, like Heesang, who is on O2 Blast, who could definitely end up on this roster, and if he's with Proper, this team will be dangerous and really, really good. So the Shock should make a lot of changes. They were a really good year, and they should just return pretty much everything and just kind of improve in the little couple areas where they can. But even then, I doubt major improvements would do a lot to improve the team because they were already very, very good this year. Next is the Seoul Dynasty. I think they should return most of their roster. I think you have to start looking to replace Fitz at this point in time. I think 2022 is his weakest season yet. He wasn't bad per se, but I think you need a dynamic hit scan player to come in now. I think you also probably look in the support line as well. Iris was good. He obviously joined the team late, so it's hard to kind of judge what he is, but I think you could benefit from having another really good flex support if you can find one somewhere. Would be really good for this team as well. But I think Prophet and Stalker are really good to build your DPS line around. Smurf's incredible. Vindime's incredible. So those four, I think, are the future for this roster. I think you build around them, and you make this team just get better around those pieces, and just add a couple little things here and there to maybe bolster it, but in general, you don't really need to make any changes. Next, Shanghai Dragons. This one hurts. They should go full rebuild. There are tons of rumors, and some aren't necessarily rumors, about the Shanghai Dragons. A lot of the players are considering retiring, if not just outright retiring. We know Void is retiring, and there's rumors about Fate retiring, Fleta retiring, Izayaki retiring. They've been around since 2018. They've been around the scene for a long time, and it seems like a pretty good time to kind of go out in the sunset with the other guys around them. And so I think this team probably is going to enter a full rebuild mode. I think they have really good pieces with Lip and Lee Jagon, who I think they'll probably build around. I don't think you let either of those two go if you can help it. You can maybe hold on to Who Are You as well. I thought he had a pretty good year this year. But I do think he has limitations, so I think you definitely have to find somebody in that damage lineup to coincide with Lip a little bit more. But overall, I do think you have a solid couple of players here that they can build around for the future, but I think you have to rebuild this roster based on what we've seen from them and some of the reports and rumors for this team. I think they're going to be entering full rebuild mode, and so the Shanghai Dragons, to me, are one of those teams that should just embrace it. Don't try to salvage what you have so far, and just kind of something like where you have a team of players that are kind of on the way out, and you try to just milk the last drops of them. Just cut them loose. I think if they choose to continue playing, they're one of those things where they're going to be better as a whole than they will. They're going to be better as an individual than they will as a whole. So keep Lip, keep Lee Jagon, rebuild around them. Toronto Defiant are next, and I think they should retool their roster. I think if you can hold on to Hisu, Twilight, Chorong, you have the foundations of a really solid roster. I think even Finale would be good to keep. I think you need to get an elite flex DPS player to play alongside Hisu, whether that be someone like Kisang, or that be someone else in contenders, or even someone like Yaki potentially. That has to be your number one priority there. And I think you need to improve the tank line. I don't think Muse or Hoppa are particularly exceptional this year. I could see Hoppa being someone who sticks around because he provides veteran leadership and a veteran presence, but I think you need to find somebody to be a tank for this team who can be young and really big playmaker. Would be a good thing for this Defiant roster. But I think they're very, very close to being an elite roster. I think they just have to get those two main things right, a tank and a hit flex DPS, and then I think they will be an elite level roster that'll compete next year. Next is the Vancouver Titans. This team's going full rebuild. Depay is out. They have a new general manager. Moss is gone. Full rebuild for this roster. Hold on to Aspire if you can. Otherwise, I think you just go full rebuild and try to find a new way to make this roster work. I will say the Boston Uprising players are an interesting group of players to look at, considering Baroy's history with that team. Maybe they do try to bring in some of them. Maybe Punk is who they choose to build this Titans roster around for the future. But to me, you're going in a completely new direction. You're going to have a new coach. You have a new general manager. He doesn't have the loyalty to these players that you see from some of these other rosters that have people that have been in the organization for a while. So just embrace it, go full rebuild, and create something new that can compete with the other teams in your region. And finally is the Washington Justice, the roster that had so much promise for back-to-back seasons and never met it. I absolutely expect this team to rebuild. Pri is out as general manager. They already got rid of a bunch of players during the season. So I'm I think it's pretty likely that this team is going full rebuild mode, and there will not be much to look at this Justice roster from this past year and to kind of see them remaining. I think this team's going to go for rebuild. Very likely a Western roster, so maybe they eyeball someone like DPay, but I definitely expect the Justice to full rebuild and be a new roster in 2023. So those are my thoughts on all of the rosters in the league right now and what direction I think they should take their teams. Some of them may be a little bit of hot takes. Some of them maybe you guys disagree with. So I'd love to hear from you in the comments down below your thoughts. If you agree, disagree. If you do disagree, why, and what you think they should do instead. If you agree with any of them, if there's a hot take I made, a potential hot take that you strongly agree with, let me know about that as well. I'd love to hear from you in the comments down below. But that's all for me for today. Thank you all once again for watching. Hope you're all staying safe and staying healthy. And until next time, bye-bye.